All right, today we're diving into a really fascinating analysis. It takes some well-known, authenticated Islamic narrations, we're talking about hadith, specifically about women, and puts them right up against the modern scientific record. Now, this isn't about theology, it's really an evidentiary challenge. We're going to look at what these texts claim and see how those claims hold up through a modern lens. So let's jump right in. So this quote you're seeing, "I have not seen anyone more deficient in intelligence and religion than you." Wow. That comes from Sahih al-Bukhari, one of the most authoritative hadith collections out there. And, it's a perfect example of the kind of text that can be really challenging for a modern audience. The analysis we're digging into today doesn't just brush these aside. Nope, it confronts them head on. And in this explainer, we're going to break down exactly how it does that, step by step.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this whole thing. First, we'll look at the common ways these texts are usually defended. Then we'll see how the source material critiques those very defenses. After that, we get to the real heart of the matter, putting the hadith claims up against modern evidence. We'll then zoom out to see how these individual pieces fit into a bigger picture, a whole structure, before we get to the source's final, pretty powerful argument.
All right, first up, the texts and their defenses. Look, if you've ever been part of a discussion about these topics, you've probably heard some of the same arguments come up again and again, right? Ways to explain or contextualize these pretty tough narrations. Well, the analysis we're looking at identifies 6 of the most common ones. Let's go ahead and lay them out.
And here they are. You know the ones. The argument that the context was super specific, not for all time. Or that it's a mistranslation, the original Arabic means something else entirely. Another one is pointing to other, more positive uplift hadiths about women. Then there's the idea that it wasn't the texts, but later scholars who distorted the meaning, or that you have to see it through the lens of historical relativity. It was progressive for its time. And finally, the idea that this is all just about personal practice, not some kind of public law. The source material basically sets these up as the standard playbook of explanations, the very ones it's about to put to the test.
Okay, so how does this analysis critique these defenses? Well, instead of picking them apart one by one, it does something different. It zooms in on one single powerful thing they all have in common, an idea that it argues pretty much undermines the whole lot of them. And here it is. This is the big meta argument. For any of those defenses to be true, whether it's about context or mistranslation or whatever, you have to believe something pretty incredible. You have to believe that for 1,400 years, an entire civilization of Islamic scholarship, we're talking native Arabic speakers, the greatest legal minds across every major school of thought, they all fundamentally misunderstood their own texts. Every single one of them missed the correct, gentler meaning. The point being made is that this isn't just a new interpretation, it's a complete rejection of the entire scholarly tradition. So that brings us to the real core of this analysis. It pivots away from that whole theological back and forth and does something much more direct. It takes the claims made right there in the hadith, the empirical, testable claims, and puts them head-to-head with modern, peer-reviewed data from science and social science. So let's go back to that first hadith we looked at. Remember the part that says, "Is not the evidence of 2 women equal to the witness of 1 man?" And then connects it directly by saying, "This is the deficiency in your intelligence." See, that's not just a legal rule being stated. It's making an explicit, testable claim about cognition, about biology, about intelligence. So how does that claim actually stack up against the evidence we have today? Well, if you look at cognitive science, the consensus is pretty overwhelming. There's something called the gender similarities hypothesis, and it shows that, cognitively, males and females are far, far more alike than they are different. The analysis also points out a huge logical flaw here. You can't use a man-made legal rule as evidence for a supposed natural state. That's just textbook circular reasoning. And this chart really drives the point home. It's from a huge landmark study by Janet Hyde. And look at that. 78% of all measured psychological differences between genders, and that includes intelligence, are either small or basically zero. The overlap is massive. What that means scientifically is that making these huge, sweeping generalizations about a cognitive deficiency, it's just not defensible with the data we have. Okay, let's take a look at another example, another authenticated narration. This one says that if a husband calls his wife to bed and she refuses, the angels will curse her until morning. Now, this text became a foundational piece, a real cornerstone for how classical Islamic law understood and defined marital obligations. So the analysis here reframes this whole thing using the tools of social science. And what you find is, what the hadith frames as a religious obligation, modern psychology has a very different name for: coercive control. The threat of a supernatural punishment for saying no, that functions as a powerful tool to restrict someone's bodily autonomy. And that dynamic is a core component of what defines an abusive relationship. And we're not talking about theoretical harm here. This is real, documented stuff. Research from major bodies like the World Health Organization shows the severe consequences of this kind of coercion. We're talking about higher rates of PTSD and depression, increased risk of physical injury, and psychological trauma that studies have found can be just as bad as, and sometimes even worse than, the trauma from stranger rape. All right, now we're getting to a really crucial turning point in the analysis. The argument isn't just about a couple of problematic texts in isolation. No, the argument is that these texts actually interlock. They fit together to build a coherent, systematic architecture of hierarchy. Let's take a look at how that works. So, to understand the next piece, we need to get a handle on one key Arabic word, awra. Now, according to the standard classical lexicons, like Lane's, the meaning here really isn't ambiguous. It refers to nakedness, to the parts of the body that are indecent to expose, basically something that must be covered and concealed. Okay, now look at how this next authenticated hadith uses that word. It's really specific. It doesn't say a woman has awra or that a part of her is awra. It says woman is awra, her entire being, and then it goes on to frame her simply being out in public as an act of the devil, making her seem attractive to men. So what are the consequences of that kind of framing? Well, the analysis points to some profound downstream effects. First, it displaces male agency, right? It's Satan's fault, not the man's choice. Second, it directly enables victim attribution. Her very presence becomes the reason for the sin. This then provides a perfect theological justification for restricting women's access to public spaces. And for women themselves, it forces them into a state of constant self-policing, of self-objectification. And that brings us to the final argument, the part that ties all of these different threads together. It's about stepping back and looking at the whole picture, seeing the complete architecture that these individual bricks have built. Because when you look at them all together, the source argues they create a comprehensive system. It's a system that diminishes and regulates a woman's mind, calling it deficient. It diminishes her spiritual worth as the majority in hell. It diminishes her body, framing it as a bad omen or something that can invalidate prayer. Her role in the home is defined by absolute obedience, and her presence in public, that's cast as an instrument of Satan. It's a system that, as you can see, touches literally every single part of her life. And so, this all leads to the final stark conclusion of the analysis. The problem isn't just a few isolated verses that have been misunderstood. The argument is the architecture. That consistent, interlocking system, that's the point. And the conclusion it reaches is that the issue doesn't lie with 1,400 years of brilliant scholars all getting it wrong, but with the plain meaning of the texts themselves. And that really leaves us with a final, pretty profound question to think about. What we've just walked through is an analysis that presents a direct, evidence-based challenge to a traditional framework. So the question is, what happens when faith and falsifiability collide? What happens when a claim can be tested and the evidence points in a different direction? That's the challenge left on the table.